Aliens thought they were the only Deathworlders, until they met humans. The signal came in at 0317, station time, and I was the only one still awake in the xenobiology wing when it did. I had been working through a stack of habitat adjustment reports for the Polari delegation, a species so physically fragile that even the air pressure aboard the Sovereign patients had to be manually recalibrated 3 times a day to keep them comfortable. It was dull work, the kind I usually delegated to junior researchers, but the delegation lead had specifically requested my involvement, and I had learned long ago that the politics of comfort mattered more in this galaxy than most warriors ever admitted. The Polari were important trade partners. They were also easily offended, easily startled, and needed the ambient humidity of their quarters adjusted by the hour. I was on my 14th humidity report of the evening when the alert tone sounded. Low, steady, without urgency. A simple flag from our long-range communication array. I almost ignored it. I am glad I did not. I remember the moment of almost ignoring it with the precision that people remember small choices that turned out not to be small. I had one hand on the queue management control and one eye on the Polari humidity spreadsheet, and I hesitated for a single second before reaching for the signal analysis instead. A single second in a 30-year career. I think about that sometimes, about the weight of ordinary moments, and how the most significant ones are identical in texture to the forgettable ones, right up until they are not. My first instinct, I will be honest, was to add it to the morning queue. Late-night signals from the outer array were rarely interesting. We received ghost echoes from dead probe relays, drift pattern anomalies from uncharted debris fields, and occasionally the sad repeated broadcasts of old automated distress beacons from ships that had been recovered decades ago and whose signals were still traveling outward on their original trajectories, looking for help that had long since arrived. I had filed dozens of those over the years. They always carried a particular kind of loneliness. This signal was not lonely. This signal was purposeful. I sat up straighter. I pulled the raw data onto my primary screen and began working through it in the way that my training had made automatic. Frequency first, then pattern, then content. Frequency was unusual but not impossible. Pattern was immediately different from anything in our archive. And content. The content was what made me put down the Polari humidity report and not think about it again for 3 days. The signal was clean, structured, and entirely unfamiliar. It was not the frequency pattern of any registered member of the Galactic Cooperative. It was not a distress call. It was not an automated navigation beacon. It carried intentional content, layered in a way that suggested whoever had sent it understood that a receiving party might not share their language and had prepared accordingly. Mathematical sequences first, the universal foundation, pi and prime numbers, and the constants that hold true regardless of what atmosphere you breathe, or what star you orbit. Then visual reference grids, geometric progressions, coordinate systems, rendered in a format that was foreign, but not impenetrable. Then something that took our translation matrix nearly 40 minutes to begin unpacking. A name, a designation, a greeting. The ship identified itself as the Galactic Survey Vessel Thermopylae, registry number UEN-0047, operating under the authority of something called the United Earth Navy. I sat back in my chair and read that line 4 times. Earth was not on any chart I had ever seen. I had access to the most complete stellar cartography database maintained by the Korath Dominion, which meant I had access to the most complete stellar cartography database in the known galaxy. We had mapped 312 inhabited systems and over 2,000 uninhabited ones across a span of our arm of the galaxy that took, even at optimal transit speed, 11 years to traverse corner to corner. We knew where the life was. We knew where the potential for life was. We had surveyed, flagged, and cataloged every system of any biological interest within our reach. There was no Earth. There was no United Earth Navy. There was nothing in the direction that signal originated from, except what our records showed as unremarkable empty space, with a moderate output yellow star at its center, one planet in the habitable zone, notation filed under low priority, no follow-up scheduled. Someone had filed that notation. I would later spend some time thinking about who it was, and whether they were the most consequential researcher in Korath history, for reasons they never intended. And yet the signal was real. The ship was real. and it was heading toward the cooperative's nearest border waypoint at a measured, deliberate pace that suggested it knew exactly what it was doing, where it was going, and how long it intended to take getting there. I filed a full report to the council before sunrise. I included the raw signal data, my preliminary frequency analysis, and the translated content, such as it was, and I recommended immediate diplomatic engagement. I also volunteered to lead the first contact team personally. I told myself it was professional instinct, the correct application of my expertise to a situation that required it. It was something closer to a curiosity I had not felt in many years, the kind that wakes up a part of your mind that has been quietly dormant and reminds you why you chose this career in the first place. The council approved the mission within 6 hours. Not because they took the signal seriously, I think, but because they didn't. The general consensus among the senior members, as communicated through the response notes, was that this was likely a lost colony vessel from one of the minor registered species that had wandered significantly off course, or possibly a sophisticated malfunctioning probe that had developed a rudimentary communication pattern through cascading system errors. Colony vessels did get lost. Probes did malfunction. Neither scenario was unprecedented, neither required significant concern, and both could be resolved with a diplomatic team and a politely worded redirect notice. They approved the engagement with the same bureaucratic energy one uses to sign off on a routine inspection, which is to say they approved it without reading past the first summary page. I was given a diplomatic cruiser, a crew of 40, and a formal authority letter that essentially said, "Go find out what this is, and if it is interesting, tell us." I brought 12 members of my research staff, the ones I trusted to be observant, without being obtrusive, thorough, without being obvious. Selecting them had taken longer than I expected. The standard diplomatic research team for a first contact mission was 8 people. I exceeded that limit by requesting 4 additional specializations from the biology and communication departments. The mission coordinator had flagged the request as an exception requiring written justification. I wrote the justification at 0500. 3 hours after reading the signal analysis, in language that I tried to keep measured and professional. The last line said, "I believe the additional specialists will be necessary. Please trust my assessment on this." The coordinator approved the exception without further comment. I owe her an acknowledgement I have not yet delivered. I brought 12 members of my research staff, and I should say their names here, because this story belongs to all of them. Priel, Senna Voth, Caleb Wright, Drev, and 8 others whose specific observations and recorded data filled the research database that made the final report possible. History tends to remember the person who signs the document. The document is made by everyone who was in the room. I brought my best translation systems, the ones that had been continuously updated through 53 prior first contact situations. I brought my junior colleague Priel, who was annoying in the particular way that very intelligent young researchers often are, meaning she asked too many questions, frequently interrupted established lines of reasoning, and was, in her particular way, right about things more often than was comfortable. She was also, I had come to accept over 3 years of working together, irreplaceable. I also brought, at the last minute, an additional data processing unit that I told myself was for backup redundancy, and not because something about the structure of the signal had made me want more computational power on hand than standard protocol required. We intercepted the Thermopylae at waypoint 11, in the outer margin of what the cooperative considered monitored space. The ship was already there when we arrived. It had reached the waypoint before us, and was holding position, with the kind of patience that told me whoever was flying it had done a great deal of waiting in their professional life, and had made their peace with the experience. It was not impatient waiting. It was settled waiting. The kind that looks like an object at rest, but is actually an object that is very ready to move. It was not a small vessel. I had expected something modest. The signals from unknown origins, in my experience, have come from modest vessels, exploration craft, survey ships, the kind of relatively light construction that represents a civilization's reach, slightly exceeding its grasp. What I saw instead made me quietly and immediately revise my expectations. The Thermopylae was long, longer than our diplomatic cruiser. It was heavily plated, the kind of layered construction that suggests the designers were not thinking about travel efficiency as their primary concern. They were thinking about what the ship might encounter, and ensuring that whatever it encountered would not end the journey. The hull showed signs of prior repair in at least a dozen places, clearly visible from our approach distance, not sloppily patched but carefully restored, the way you restore something you intend to keep using for a long time because you have decided it is worth keeping. Each repaired section was as solid as the original, structurally reliable, but visibly different in the small ways that work done at a different time in a different place always differs. This ship had a history of contact with hostile conditions, and it had come through each one. There were weapon arrays positioned along its flanks. I want to be precise about how I describe this, because the distinction matters. They were not threatening in their orientation. They were not raised, not aimed, not positioned in any way that suggested aggression toward us, but they were present, visible, clearly functional, the kind of weapon systems that a vessel does not bother to disguise because disguising them would require explaining their absence, and explaining their absence would be a kind of performance that a vessel with nothing to hide does not bother to perform. Whoever had designed this ship had designed it with the understanding that the universe was not a friendly place, and that a ship that did not acknowledge this understanding would not remain a ship for long. Which, I thought, was a reasonable assumption. Our communication request was answered in under a minute. A human face appeared on our screen. She had dark hair cut close to her head, close enough that I could see the precise line where it stopped. The deliberate and practical choice of someone who had decided long ago that their appearance should not require management time. Her eyes were a shade of brown so deep they were nearly black, and they looked at me with the steady, measuring quality of a person who has been looking at things carefully for many years, and has developed the habit of not looking away when something is worth examining. Her jaw carried the kind of set tension that comes not from anger, but from the long habit of holding a great deal of thought very still behind an expression that reveals nothing, until the owner decides it should. She wore a uniform in dark gray and navy. The insignia at her collar and shoulder were a design I did not yet know how to read, but I filed them carefully. She said, in our language, imperfectly but clearly, "This is Admiral Nora Vale, commanding officer of the Thermopylae. We are here in peace. We are here to meet whoever comes." I stared. Not at the words, at the fact that she had spoken them in our language at all. Priel, standing just behind my left shoulder, said very quietly, in a tone she kept completely flat with visible effort, "They have been listening to our communications for some time." I did not respond to Priel. I needed a moment. I collected it, and then I introduced myself, my title, and my authority, and I told the Admiral we would like to conduct a formal first contact meeting in person, aboard a neutral docking configuration. She agreed immediately, and suggested her ship's secondary bay, which she said could be configured for atmospheric compatibility. I asked how she knew what atmosphere we required. She said calmly that they had identified our species from long-range biological sensor sweeps conducted during their approach, and had prepared accordingly. I did not like that answer. I found it efficient in a way that made the back of my mind uncomfortable. They had identified us, from long range, during their approach, which meant the identification had preceded the contact, which meant they had known what they were approaching before they made themselves visible, which meant the measured, deliberate pace I had observed in their approach trajectory was not the cautious movement of an uncertain explorer. It was the deliberate movement of something that had already done its homework. But I agreed to the meeting because there was nothing else to do, and because declining the meeting of a lifetime on the grounds that the other party was better prepared than expected would have been professionally indefensible. We docked 4 hours later. I spent those 4 hours in a way that I think reveals something about the effect this species had on me from the very first communication. I reviewed every piece of publicly available information we had on the direction the signal had originated from. Not because I expected to find Earth, which we had not had, but because I was trying to understand how a civilization capable of the signal I had just received had remained invisible to us. I was looking for the gap in our awareness. What I found was a notation in the Deep Survey archives dated 47 years before this meeting. A survey probe had passed within 3 light-years of what the archive listed as Sol System, Class G Star, Single Habitable World Candidate, no detectable artificial electromagnetic emissions, no follow-up recommended. The surveyor had noted the habitable world, had noted the silence, had assumed, which was a perfectly reasonable assumption at the time, that silence meant no one was home. The silence, it turned out, was because they were 47 years away from being ready to make noise. I stared at that archive entry for a while. Then I closed it and went to prepare for the meeting. The bay they had prepared was large and well lit, with a light spectrum that was close enough to our own comfort range that I suspected it was another deliberate adjustment. It smelled of something faintly metallic that I later learned was the recycled air system common to human long-haul vessels, a smell that their crews apparently stopped noticing within the first few weeks, and thereafter considered simply the smell of being aboard a ship. They had set up a table, large enough for both delegations, with chairs arranged on their side, and what appeared to be custom-fabricated resting structures on ours, built to approximate Korath body proportions, with a degree of accuracy that told me someone had access to either our public biological records or a very good reconstruction model. They had done all of this in 4 hours, from sensor data alone. There were 6 humans at the table. The Admiral was in the center. She was taller than I expected, standing with a posture that was not stiff but was very straight in the way of someone who has been told to stand straight so often, and for so long, that the body simply does it without instruction. Most of her crew behind her were also tall, though the variations in their height and build and coloring were remarkable even within this small sample. They were a species of visible difference, these humans. Where Korath tend toward a reliable biological range in our physical presentation, humans seem to have been assembled from a much wider set of specifications. The one to the Admiral's immediate left was very tall and very pale with light-colored eyes. The one to her right was considerably shorter, broader in the shoulders, with a complexion several shades darker. Behind them, 3 more in a range of builds and colorings that seemed almost deliberate in its variety, as if someone had selected the 6 most visually distinct members of the crew for maximum representational breadth. Perhaps they had. I would not have been surprised. What struck me first was not their size or their variety. It was their stillness. They were watching us, the way I have only ever seen experienced hunters watch something. Not with tension, not with excitement, not with the bright, visible alertness of something encountering the unfamiliar, with a quality of attention that was complete and unhurried at the same time, as if they had all the sensory data they needed and were simply processing it at a rate that did not require outward expression, like they were filing everything away and had all the time in the world to do it. The Admiral stood when I entered. She extended her hand, the right one, palm forward, fingers together, and then opening, a gesture I had studied in their communication records enough to understand as greeting, and offered trust simultaneously. I extended my hand in return. She gripped it. I am a Korath. I want you to understand what that means before I describe what happened next. My species evolved on Korthan 4, over millions of years of specific pressure. Our skeletal structure is dense. Our musculature is built for an environment that would require significantly more effort from most other species simply to stand in. My grip strength is, by the standards of every species in the cooperative, considerable. I have shaken the hands and hands equivalents of representatives from 41 different species. I do not typically concern myself with the physical dimensions of a greeting. I was concerned about this one. Not because she was trying to hurt me. She was not. The grip was friendly, calibrated, and brief, a professional's handshake rather than a demonstration. What concerned me was the simple, unavoidable physical data of it, the resistance in her fingers, the density of her palm, the quiet, complete competence in the way her hand closed around mine and released. This was not a creature performing strength for effect. This was a creature for whom that level of physical presence was simply ordinary, the unremarkable baseline of her everyday existence, the same way our own baseline is unremarkable to us. I sat down. She sat down. We began. She spoke well. Her team's translation work was impressive. More than impressive. It was frankly extraordinary for a species with no established contact history. The imperfections in her delivery were the imperfections of someone who had learned from recorded material, rather than live interaction, which meant the recorded material had been of sufficient quality and quantity to produce functional fluency, which brought me back to how long they had been listening to our communications, and how much they had absorbed. She explained their origin point, their exploration history, and their reasons for this journey. She was honest in the way that people are honest when they have decided honesty is the most efficient strategy, not because they are naive, but because they have thought it through, and concluded that truth moves faster than its alternative, and they prefer to move fast. She told me Earth had known about the existence of other intelligent life in the galaxy for 11 years before this meeting. She said this plainly, without apology or drama, the way you state a fact. She told me they had spent those 11 years studying from a distance before making contact. 11 years of observation without revealing themselves. 11 years of learning before speaking. She told me they had chosen this particular moment deliberately, when their technology and their understanding were, in her words, ready enough. I asked what she meant by ready enough. She looked at me with those dark, still eyes and said, ready enough to be taken seriously. I did not know what to say to that. I moved the conversation forward. At the end of the meeting, her science officer, a man named Lieutenant Owen Farr, placed a data drive on the table. He was younger than the Admiral, with the kind of restless physical energy that researchers often carry, a quality of perpetual slight motion that made him seem as if he was always about to look at something more closely. He placed the drive carefully, with both hands, and said it contained everything they were willing to share about their species, their world, their biology, and their history. He pushed it toward me with a simple, open-handed gesture and said, "No conditions attached. We just thought you'd want to know." I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up. I thanked them. I told them we would review the materials and arrange a follow-up session within 2 cycles. We walked back to our ship. The docking tunnel between us was about 60 meters long, and I counted my steps the entire way, not out of any particular purpose, but because my mind was doing the thing it does when it has more data than it can immediately sort. It finds something small and countable to occupy the surface, while the deeper processing continues. 43 steps. 43 steps between the Thermopylae secondary bay and the Sovereign Patience's docking seal. I remember thinking, the treaty that is going to change the structure of this galaxy was written in a room 43 steps from where I am standing. I did not know yet that I was right. But I was right. I did not speak until the docking tunnel sealed behind us, and I was certain we were out of what I assumed was their sensor range, which I was not actually certain of at all, given the day I had just had. But the silence felt necessary. Priel said, "Did you notice how the one on the far left never moved his hands below the table the entire time?" I said I had noticed. She said, "He was comfortable. That wasn't nervousness. He just prefers to keep his options available." I thought about the weapon arrays on the Thermopylae's hull. Present, visible, not disguised. I thought about the custom fabricated resting structures in the bay, built from sensor data in 4 hours. I thought about 11 years of listening. I said, "Priel." She said, "Yes?" I said, "Write everything down. All of it. Every observation." She already had been. I knew she had been. She had a data pad in her hand, and had been writing for the entire walk back. I just needed to say something, because the alternative was standing in that corridor admitting to her that a 30-year career in xenobiology had just handed me something I did not have a category for, and I was not ready to say that out loud yet. I went to my quarters. I sat down. I held the data drive in my hands and looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something that you know is going to matter before you know in exactly what way it is going to matter. Then I opened it. The first file was a simple document, plain text. No decoration, no visual formatting, nothing that was not necessary. The heading read, "A brief introduction to Earth and its people." The second line read, "We understand this may be a lot. Take your time." I read through the night without stopping. By the time the station lights cycled to their morning simulation, I had barely reached the section on human immune system evolution, and I had already revised my threat assessment of this species 3 times. The 4th revision was taking shape somewhere in the back of my mind, just beyond the reach of words. Priel knocked on my door at the first light cycle, with 2 cups of something hot that I recognized as the stimulant drink she kept for long research sessions, and a look on her face that said she had also been reading all night and had arrived at her own version of the same place I was standing. She sat down across from me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Their planet tried to end all complex life on it 5 times. I said, 6, if you count the..." She said, 7. I found the 7th event in the geological data appendix. It was a smaller event, but it had a 92% surface impact radius. 7 extinction-level events. We sat with that for a moment. Then she said, quietly, and with the particular care of someone choosing words that feel almost too large to fit inside ordinary speech. And they're the ones who made it. I set down my cup. I looked at the drive sitting on the desk between us. This small, unremarkable object containing 412 files about a species that had survived 7 attempts by their own planet to end all complex life, and had come out the other side of it flying a warship to the edge of the known galaxy to introduce themselves. I said, "Schedule a full team briefing. And Priel?" She looked at me. "Update the report classification to priority." She nodded once. She did not ask why, or suggest the classification was premature. She stood and left. I picked up the data drive again. I thought about what Admiral Vale had said. Ready enough to be taken seriously. I thought about how 11 years of silent observation was not the behavior of a species that was uncertain whether the galaxy would take them seriously. It was the behavior of a species that had decided to guarantee it. I thought, yes, I think you are. And then I went back to reading, because there were still 398 files remaining, and every single one of them, I was becoming increasingly certain, was going to matter. The data drive contained 412 files. I know that number because I counted them twice. Not out of thoroughness, though I am a thorough person. I counted them because I needed something simple and concrete to hold on to, while the contents of those files quietly rearranged the furniture of everything I thought I knew about life in this galaxy. Counting was easy. Counting had a definite answer. It was the last definite answer I would have for quite some time. I started, as any reasonable scientist would, with the biological data. It seemed the safest place to begin. Biology is my discipline. I have spent 30 years developing frameworks for understanding how life evolves, how it adapts, how the specific pressures of a given environment shape the creatures that survive it. I have cataloged 63 species across the cooperative, lived among 14 of them for extended research periods, and published what the Dominion Science Board considers definitive assessments of 12 distinct evolutionary pathways. I know how to read a biology report. I know what the numbers mean and what the exceptions are, and how to place any new data within the established context of everything that has been known and verified. I was not prepared for this one. Let me be more specific about what I mean, because "not prepared" is a phrase that does inadequate work for the experience. I have spent my career encountering the unexpected. That is, in some ways, the entire point of the career. Every new species presents something outside the prior framework. Every new world revises a previous assumption. I have learned to hold my frameworks loosely, to treat each new datum as an invitation to update, rather than a challenge to defend. I am, professionally speaking, trained for surprise. What the Earth biology files presented was not a single surprise, or even a series of surprises. It was a systematic, compounding series of challenges to assumptions I had not known I was making, which is a different and considerably more difficult experience, because you cannot prepare for the revision of something you did not know needed revising. Earth sat, the file explained, in what our own astronomers had long classified as a relatively average position in its solar system. Moderate star output, a yellow-class star of no particular distinction, reasonable orbital distance, well within standard habitable zone parameters. The atmospheric composition was familiar enough. Nitrogen dominant, oxygen sufficient, trace gases unremarkable. The gravity was 9.8 meters per second squared, which by Korath standards was almost gentle. Our homeworld, Korthan 4, pulls at 14.2. We had always assumed, without examining that assumption too carefully, that higher gravity meant harder life, and harder life meant stronger species. The equation was simple, and it had held up consistently across every inhabited world we had ever catalogued. Earth broke it. Not because Earth's gravity was secretly higher than measured. It was not. Earth broke it because the equation itself was incomplete, which is the most dangerous kind of wrong. The kind that is right enough to go unchallenged for a very long time. Gravity is one variable. Earth had been running a much more complex experiment, and it had been running it for a very long time. I read about the predator load first, because predator load is the first thing I examine in any new biological system. It tells you more about the pressure an environment exerts on its life than almost any other single metric, because predators are the environment's most direct and immediate statement about what it expects from the things that share it. You look at what predators have evolved, what capabilities they have developed, what strategies they rely on, and you learn what pressure has been applied. You look at what survived alongside those predators, and you learn what the pressure produced. I had used this methodology across 63 species. It had never failed to orient me quickly and accurately. On Earth, it took me 6 hours of reading to begin understanding what I was looking at, and I was not sure I fully understood it until I had been there in person. It tells you more about the pressure an environment exerts on its life than almost any other single metric. The number of distinct apex predator lineages that had evolved on Earth, competing simultaneously for territory, for prey, competing with each other across every landmass, and in every ocean, and at every altitude, was larger than the total predator diversity across the 3 planets we had previously classified as the most biologically hostile in the cooperative's entire cataloged survey range. Those 3 planets were considered extreme cases, cautionary examples in xenobiology training modules. Earth made them look mild. Earth had not produced one dominant line of ultimate survivors. It had produced dozens, simultaneously, across every possible ecological context. The oceans alone had generated multiple independent apex lineages. The land surface, divided across several major continental plates, had run what amounted to separate evolutionary tournaments, each producing its own champions. And then those continental plates had occasionally drifted together, mixing the champions, forcing new competitions, generating new pressures, over and over, in every direction, all at once. The animals that emerged from that competition were extraordinary, in ways that I found myself reading 3 and 4 times to ensure I was not misunderstanding the data. I read about a creature that could sense the electromagnetic fields generated by the nervous system activity of other animals, and use that sense to hunt through solid matter. I read about ambush hunters that could remain completely motionless for extended periods, cooling their metabolic output so thoroughly that vegetation began to grow on their skin before they struck. I read about social hunters that had developed coordinated pursuit strategies, sophisticated enough that several prominent Earth biologists had spent decades arguing about whether to classify them as exhibiting culture. The answer, the file concluded with a kind of scholarly resignation, was probably yes. And then I read about humans. Humans had not been the apex predators, not at the start. I want to be clear about this because it matters for understanding what they became. In the early period of their evolution, measured against the biological field they shared, they were comparatively unimpressive. No venom, no armored external structure, no significant size advantage over most of the predators that shared their territory. Their equivalent of claws were vestigial tools at best, insufficient as weapons against the things that hunted them. Their teeth were generalist equipment, useful for many things, specialized for none. Their speed in a direct sprint was adequate, and no more. The animals that hunted them were, by any objective biological assessment, better equipped for the environment they all shared. And yet here we were. What humans had, I found as I worked through the early biology files, was a collection of traits that I initially cataloged as individually unremarkable. It was only when I looked at them as a system, as an integrated set of features operating together toward a common output, that the picture changed. They could sweat. I understand that this sounds trivial. It is not. Most of Earth's large animals regulate their body temperature through panting, which requires stopping or significantly slowing to manage heat effectively, through shade-seeking during the hottest periods, through behavioral adaptation that costs time and position and momentum. Sweating, the continuous evaporative cooling of the skin surface, allowed humans to maintain high-intensity physical output for periods that would force most other animals to stop and recover. They could not outrun what they hunted. They could not overpower it, but they could keep it moving. They could follow it at a sustained pace that allowed no real rest, that kept the prey animal's core temperature climbing, that accumulated the debt of effort hour by hour until the animal made a fatal mistake, or simply stopped, too exhausted to run further, and turned to find the human still there, still coming, still not done. They called this persistence hunting. I thought about that name for a long time. It is almost gentle for what it describes. It is a strategy built on a single, simple, devastating principle. The human does not stop. The human cannot be worn out before the thing it is following, because the human is designed, at a biological level, for the specific purpose of continuing after everything else has paused. I thought about the Admiral's handshake. I thought about the Thermopylae waiting at waypoint 11, with the settled patience of something that had done a great deal of waiting and found no particular difficulty in it. I thought about 11 years of observation before making contact. I thought about how many ways those three things were the same thing. Then I kept reading. The immune system section was where I began writing notes so quickly that I filled an entire data pad before I understood I had done it. I set the pad aside, retrieved a second one, and continued. The human immune system was not simply competent. It was adaptive in a way that I had no existing framework to contain. Over thousands of generations, humans had been exposed to an extraordinary range of organisms that wished them harm. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, and countless other microscopic entities that had evolved in close parallel with them, specifically shaped by that evolution to exploit human biology. Many of those organisms had, at various points in human history, reduced the human population to a fraction of its prior size. The numbers in the historical records were staggering, even by the scale of other catastrophic events I had studied. What the human immune system had done in response to each of those events was not merely survive. It had cataloged the threat. It had developed specific biochemical memory of the attack pattern. It had, over time, and contact and loss, built a biological reference library of responses that could be activated on subsequent exposure to the same threat, faster, and more specifically than the first time. The immune system did not just fight, it learned, and it remembered. The disease section led naturally into the medicine section, and this was where I set the datapad down entirely and simply sat with what I had just read. Humans had developed the practice of deliberately introducing weakened or inert versions of harmful pathogens into their own bodies, for the specific purpose of triggering the immune system's learning response against something that could not, in its weakened form, cause serious harm. They taught their own biology to recognize a future threat by showing it a preview. They called this vaccination, and it had, the file noted in a dry statistical appendix, prevented more deaths in their history than any other single medical intervention. I read that sentence twice. This was a species that had looked at the mechanisms that were killing them and said, "We will understand this. We will use this. We will take the thing that is trying to end us and turn it into the preparation for the next time it tries." I stared at my viewport for a while. The stars outside were the same stars they had always been. The universe had not changed. I had. Then I opened the history section. This was, in retrospect, a significant misjudgment in terms of sleep. I did not sleep for the next 31 hours. Human history is long by the standards of spacefaring civilization, recorded history stretching back more than 5,000 years, with fragmentary evidence of organized society extending significantly further than that. And it is eventful in ways that I found increasingly difficult to process with the professional detachment my training is supposed to guarantee. They had spent the majority of their recorded existence in conflict with each other, not occasional border disputes or resource competitions that resolved through negotiation. Sustained, organized, systematically escalating conflict refined over thousands of years into increasingly sophisticated and destructive forms, each generation finding new methods, each new method raising the ceiling on what was possible. At first reading, this confirmed what I had half expected, and, I will admit, what I had somewhat hoped to find. A violent species, territorial and aggressive, self-limiting in the way that aggressive species often are, consuming each other's potential, until only the hardiest survived. It would have been a clean and familiar story, but the picture was considerably more complicated than that. In between every conflict, in every space that war left open, there was something else happening simultaneously. Trade across distances that should have made it impossible. Art of a sophistication and emotional range that I found, reading the descriptions, genuinely affecting. Science, with multiple independent cultures on opposite sides of the planet, developing equivalent mathematical frameworks within the same century, as if the ideas were ready to exist, and simply waiting for sufficiently prepared minds to find them. Philosophy that asked, with genuine urgency and without assuming convenient answers, what behavior constituted a good life, what obligations a society carried toward its most vulnerable members, and what it meant to be human in a universe that did not always seem designed with human comfort in mind. Music, construction, the building of things intended to outlast the builders, letters written between people who had never met, carried across distances that took months to traverse, maintaining intellectual partnerships and friendships across those distances for decades, on the basis of nothing more than continued effort and the will to keep writing. And then, after the worst conflicts, something that I found harder to understand than the conflicts themselves, and yet which I kept returning to in my notes as the most significant thing in the entire history file: repair, reconciliation. The deliberate, difficult, and often slow process of rebuilding what damage had broken, not forgetting, not pretending, rebuilding, with full memory of what had happened and full acknowledgement of the cost. They had institutions for this. They had built formal structures around the idea that recovery from harm was not merely a practical necessity, but a moral commitment. They had cultural traditions that existed specifically to maintain memory of what had gone wrong, so that the work of repair had something solid to stand on. Owen Farr had included a personal note at the end of the history file. It was short, informal, the kind of thing a researcher adds when they have been living with material for a long time and want the reader to have the right orientation before they begin their own assessment. He wrote, "We know how this looks. We know what the history says about us. We also know what came after it, every time. We think the after part is the more important story. We're still working on it." I read it 3 times. I thought about what it meant that he had written it himself, had chosen to attach it, had decided that the human who would be reading this needed to know that the humans themselves were aware of the weight of what they were handing over. I called Priel. She answered before the second tone, which told me she had been awake. I said, "Have you reached the section on their conflicts yet?" She said, "I've read it twice, and I'm partway through a 3rd pass." I said, "And?" She was quiet for a moment, not uncertain. I know how Priel sounds when she is uncertain. She was choosing how to say it correctly. Then she said, "They kept going." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not just after the conflicts, after everything. After the extinction events and the disease catastrophes and the collapses of entire civilizations, every single time something happened that should have been the end of them, they just continued." I said, "What does that remind you of?" She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she said, "It reminds me of us, except our world shaped us into what we are, over millions of years of specific, consistent pressure. Their world threw everything possible at them from every direction at once, and they adapted while it was happening." I said, "That is exactly what concerns me." She said, "Or what excites you?" She was not wrong. Both things were precisely true. The scientist in me was lit up in a way I had not felt since the early years of my career, when every new catalog species felt like a revelation. The part of me that understood the practical dimensions of galactic power was engaged with something considerably less comfortable: the slow, careful recalibration of everything I had assumed about how the universe was arranged and who the most significant forces in it were. I told her to rest. She said she would after the technology section. I said the technology section would wait. She said, with great politeness and great firmness, that she disagreed. I decided not to argue about it, because she was right, and I went back to my own reading. By the time I arrived at the section on human psychology, I had accumulated 47 dense pages of research notes and a quiet, settled certainty that the Council's 6-hour dismissive approval of this mission had been one of the most consequential miscalculations in Korath diplomatic history. Not dramatic, just wrong, in the precise and particular way that assumptions based on incomplete data are always wrong. The psychology section was authored by a human academic with a name that our translation matrix initially declined to attempt. It covered a concept humans called emotional intelligence, which referred broadly to the ability to understand and respond to the internal states of others. Most advanced species develop this capacity in some form. Social existence requires it. What made the human version striking was not its existence but its reach. Humans had extended the reading capacity that most species develop only for their own kind and applied it outward, toward other species. They were documented to have formed genuine attachment relationships with dozens of Earth's non-sapient animal species, developing over generations a sensitivity to behavior and expression in creatures that shared no language with them. The same persistence that made them effective hunters appeared to apply to understanding. They observed, modeled, tested the model against new information, and adjusted without the kind of defensive resistance that typically accompanies challenges to an established interpretation. There was a specific note in the psychology section about how humans respond to genuine uncertainty. Most species, encountering a truly unknown situation, operate within a fairly narrow response range: caution or aggression, protection or attack. The choice of default varies by species, but the range itself is consistent. Humans had a documented third response that was largely absent from the literature on other species: curiosity strong enough to override the first two. Not in every individual, not in every circumstance, but as a consistent statistical feature of the species at large. When faced with something they did not understand, a significant portion of the human population moved toward it, rather than away. They examined things that were unfamiliar. They named them, cataloged them, theorized about them, disagreed about the theories, revised the theories, and wrote, sometimes, poetry about the experience of not understanding something and finding that interesting, rather than threatening. The file noted, in its final paragraph, that this mission, the first formal contact with an unknown alien civilization, had been proposed, planned, and launched by humans, specifically because it was something they did not yet understand, and therefore needed to go toward. I sat back in my chair and looked out the viewport. The stars were the same stars. The galaxy was the same galaxy. The Korath Dominion was 3,000 years old, and had been the most significant Deathworld species in the cooperative for every one of those years. None of that had changed. It was simply that the map of what was in the galaxy had turned out to be incomplete. And incomplete maps, I have spent my career learning, are the most dangerous kind, because they are convincing enough to navigate by until the moment they are not. I thought about 11 years of listening before speaking. I thought about the Thermopylae waiting at the waypoint like a patient question. I thought about Owen Farr's note: we think the after part is the more important story. I went back to the files. I want to describe the specific quality of reading I was doing at this point in the process, because it matters for understanding what happened over the following days. I was not reading as a scholar reads, looking for information to add to a prior structure of understanding. I was reading the way you read something that is actively rebuilding the structure as it goes. Every file I opened was not adding to what I knew. It was revising the framework that organized what I knew, which meant that files I had read earlier needed to be re-evaluated in the light of files I read later, and the re-evaluation generated new questions that sent me back further, and the process was genuinely recursive in a way I found both intellectually thrilling and practically exhausting. I think humans would have called it a page-turner. 260 of them still remained. I was right that every one of them would matter. I called the full team briefing at 0800. 12 researchers, 2 diplomatic attachés, a communications specialist named Caleb Wright who had spent 20 years working with nonverbal languages across 14 species, and my senior military liaison, Commander Drathon's representative on the diplomatic crew, a quiet and watchful officer named Sub-Commander Vane. Vane had said almost nothing during the first contact meeting. He had the physical stillness of someone who has been in enough genuinely dangerous situations that manufactured calm has become unnecessary. The real thing is simply more efficient. I had noticed that about him. I had also noticed that he had not shared a single observation from the files in the days since I distributed them. He had simply taken the drive, gone to his quarters, and come out for meals. He arrived at the briefing 8 minutes early, and sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded, and his eyes moving across the room, in the quiet way of a person who is always knowing where all the exits are. I opened by asking each team member for their primary finding. 3 minutes each. I wanted the shape of the data before I offered any interpretation of my own. What I got changed the character of that room. The geological specialist, a meticulous researcher named Drev, presented the planetary history data first. Earth had experienced 7 distinct mass extinction events in its deep geological record. 7. The most any other catalogued inhabited planet showed was 2, and those 2 were separated by hundreds of millions of years, with long periods of relative stability on either side of them. Earth's events were more frequent, more varied in their causes, and more comprehensive in their surface impact radius. And after each one, the file showed, life on Earth had not simply recovered to its prior state. It had recovered to a more complex state. Each catastrophe had cleared the field, allowed new forms to emerge, and the new forms were consistently more intricate, more capable, more advanced, and more complex. The file showed, life on Earth had not simply recovered to its prior state. It had recovered to a more complex state. Each catastrophe had cleared the field, allowed new forms to emerge, and the new forms were consistently more intricate, more capable, and more diverse than what had existed before the event. Earth was not a world that had reached a stable ecosystem and maintained it. Earth was a world that had been catastrophically reset, multiple times, and each time had rebuilt itself into something that the prior version would not have recognized. It was a planet in continuous, violent, generative motion. Drev put down his notes and said, "There is no other world in the catalog that shows this pattern. Not at this frequency. Not at this scale. Not with consistent post-event escalation rather than simplification." The table was quiet. Then Senavoth presented the cardiovascular data. She was careful with it. She had the precision of someone who knows that extraordinary claims require extraordinary foundation, and she had spent 3 days building the foundation before she was willing to speak about it in a group setting. She presented the structural analysis of the human heart first, its composition, its redundancy architecture, the backup pathway systems built into its operation that allowed function to be maintained even when primary channels were compromised. She presented the feedback mechanism data, the continuous adaptive loop between the heart and the broader circulatory system that allowed real-time adjustment to changing demand rather than the stepped threshold responses most species' cardiovascular systems operated on. Then she presented the survival case studies. These were documented cases of humans surviving interruptions to cardiac function that should, by any established physiological standard, have been fatal. Not survivable with immediate medical intervention, fatal before intervention could arrive. She had 6 cases in her primary file. She suspected there were significantly more in the larger medical database she had not yet fully processed. She paused after presenting the 6th case, and then said, in the careful tone of someone choosing words the way you choose footholds on unstable ground, "Their body treats damage as a design condition, not as a failure state to be prevented, but as an operating environment to be survived. The redundancy is not backup capacity for emergencies. It is standard architecture." The silence that followed her last sentence was the particular silence of a room full of researchers encountering data that requires them to substantially revise a framework they have been using for a long time. Priel presented next. She had focused on metabolic flexibility and sleep. The findings were not individually shocking, but in combination, they added another dimension to the portrait Senna had begun. Humans required sleep, yes, but their functional threshold for sleep deprivation was significantly broader than their optimal threshold. The difference, Priel explained, between how much sleep humans need for optimal function and how little sleep they can accept while remaining operationally capable is substantial enough to be clinically significant. They had evolved the capacity to run at reduced efficiency for extended periods, rather than failing below a minimum threshold. Additionally, their metabolic system could shift into a conservation mode that maintained core function on dramatically reduced caloric and hydration intake for periods well beyond what their body mass and activity level would suggest was possible. She had checked the figures 3 times. They were consistent across multiple independent human medical databases. She said, "They can keep going on less than they should need, for longer than they should be able to, and then recover when resources are restored, without the extended recovery periods other species require after significant deprivation." Caleb Wright spoke next, about language. Not just the single language they had used in the meeting, but the full scope of what the files documented. At the peak of their linguistic diversity, humans had spoken more than 7,000 distinct languages. Many were now extinct, casualties of the consolidations that came with increased global contact. Hundreds were still in active use. What this meant in biological terms, Wright explained, was that the human brain had demonstrated the capacity to support complete linguistic independence across populations, and then, when those populations reconnected, to bridge the gap. Humans were documented to learn second languages at rates that varied significantly by individual and circumstance, but trended toward fluency within 1 to 3 years of consistent exposure, across their entire lifespan, including well into their later life stages when most species' cognitive plasticity decreases sharply. He looked at his notes for a moment, and then added, "Their science officer, Far. He had our language base mapped to approximately 80% accuracy before we made visual contact. He derived it from our navigation signal data and worked backward from mathematical constants. He did this alone, as a side project, during their approach." More silence. Then Sub-Commander Vane spoke. He had been silent for the entire first half of the briefing. This was not unusual for Vane. He was someone who collected information before he offered conclusions, and who waited for the moment when he had something specific and worth saying, rather than filling the space before then with the general impressions that most of us default to when we feel we should be contributing. I had come to understand this about him over the mission. It was not reticence, it was precision. He said only one thing. He said, "I need to see the military history files." I had expected this. I had the files prepared and flagged. I brought them up on the briefing screen. What followed over the next hour changed the character of the session from a scientific review into something I could not have fully anticipated. The military history of humanity was not, as I had perhaps allowed myself to hope, a record of primitive territorial conflicts that had gradually and cleanly given way to more organized and less destructive arrangements. It was a record of systematic, iterative, increasingly sophisticated development of conflict methodology. Each significant conflict had generated new methods. Those methods had been refined between conflicts and deployed with greater capability in the next. The scale of the worst ones had consequences measured in populations, in the collapse of entire economic and social systems, in the physical reshaping of geography. And then came the weapons that changed the calculation entirely. I watched Vane's face while I read the summary of humanity's discovery and development of fission and fusion weapons. He had a very controlled face. He gave very little away. But something moved in his expression at the moment I read the documented yield figures, the range figures, the delivery system capabilities developed during the period when multiple human political groups simultaneously held this capability and directed it at each other. I read about the period called the Cold War, decades during which multiple human factions maintained sufficient destructive capacity to end their own civilization, pointed that capacity at each other across a political standoff, and did not fire. Not because the capacity was untested, not because it was doubted, because they looked at what firing would mean, and, through a combination of rational calculation and something that sat below calculation in the space where survival instinct lives, decided not to. They stood at the possibility of self-annihilation and stepped back. Then they built rockets and went to space. Vane was quiet for a long time after the file summary finished. Then he said, "What is their current weapons capability?" I said the files did not include specifications. Admiral Vale had stated clearly when handing over the drive that biology, history, and culture were offered in good faith, and that weapons systems data would follow through formal military channels once a diplomatic structure was established. Vane said, "That is a professional answer." I said, "Yes." He said, "It means they have thought carefully about what information is leverage and what information is trust. They separated the two deliberately." I said, "Yes." He looked at me, and then looked at the briefing screen for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to go on record as supporting the Alliance recommendation, whatever you decide to recommend." That surprised me. I had expected him to be the most resistant voice in the room. He was the one with the most institutionally invested interest in the Korath, remaining the singular Deathworld power in the cooperative. He saw my expression and said simply, "I have spent 30 years studying conflict. I know the difference between a species you want against you and a species you want beside you. This one should be beside us." We broke for 2 hours. When we reconvened, I called it the synthesis session, and I asked for honest conclusions rather than careful positions. Priel said, "What I cannot stop returning to is the persistence hunting. It is not merely a hunting strategy. It is a template, a philosophy of engagement with problems. You cannot outlast them. You cannot simply be stronger, or faster, or more protected. If they decide they are going to pursue something, the question is never whether they will catch it. The question is only how long it takes." Senna said, "And they apply the same template to everything: disease, science, exploration, relationships. The mechanism is the same, regardless of the domain. They identify the objective, and they do not stop moving toward it." Caleb Wright said, quietly, almost to himself, "They built a ship and flew it to the edge of everything they had ever mapped. And when they got there, they found a waypoint, and they waited. That is not the behavior of uncertainty. That is the behavior of confidence, so settled, it does not require expression." I said, "No, it is not." Then I said what I had spent 2 days building toward. I said, "The Korath Dominion has maintained its position in the Galactic Cooperative for 3,000 years, on the basis of one foundational claim, that we are the only species in the galaxy shaped by true Deathworld conditions. Every diplomatic arrangement we have, every military understanding, every assumption other species carry about the balance of power in this part of the galaxy rests on that foundation. I am going to submit a report to the Council that will require them to reconsider every element of that foundation. I will be recommending an immediate and formal alliance. The room was very quiet. Van said, "The Council will not welcome the revision." I said, "No." He said, "They will question the data. They will suggest alternative interpretations. They will point to the gravity differential and the lack of heavy exoskeletal structure and argue that we are overstating the case." I said, "They are welcome to do all of that. The data will remain the data when they are finished." He said, "What exactly are you recommending?" I had considered the wording carefully. I said, "Alliance, immediate, formal, treated with the same seriousness we would give to any relationship with a power that can match us. Not because they are a threat, because they are the kind of species that, given enough time, becomes either your closest ally or your most persistent and committed problem. And the difference between those two outcomes is entirely a function of what we do in the next 30 days. Priel said, "That is the most clear-eyed thing I have heard you say in 3 years." I told her that was not a flattering observation about the preceding 3 years. She said she was aware of that. We sent the preliminary report to the Council that evening. I attached a personal note at the end of it. The note said, "Please approach this with your full attention. I have not filed a priority report in 11 years. I am filing one now, and I am asking you to treat it accordingly." The Council acknowledged receipt within the hour. Their response came 6 hours later. It said, "Recommendation noted. Proceed with continued assessment. Full Council review scheduled in 14 days." I read that response and set it aside. 14 days. As if the appropriate unit of time for this conversation was 2 weeks, measured out in committee slots and review schedules. I went back to the files. There were still things in them I had not fully read, and I had a conviction that had become, over the past 2 days, something very close to certainty. Every unread thing mattered. Every file in that drive was a piece of a portrait I was still assembling, and I could not afford to leave any piece unexamined, simply because the committee wanted 14 days to consider the ones I had already sent. I was right about that. That night I could not sleep. This was, by that point in the mission, not unusual. But the sleeplessness had a different quality than the excited restlessness of the first days, when I was running on the energy of encountering something genuinely new. This was the quieter, more settled wakefulness of a person who has arrived at a conclusion and is sitting with it, examining it from different angles, not because they doubt it, but because they want to know its full shape before they carry it forward. The conclusion I was sitting with was simple and significant. The most important diplomatic event in Korath history had arrived not as a crisis, not as a confrontation, but as a data drive placed on a table by a scientist named Owen Farr, with a note that said no conditions attached. We just thought you'd want to know. That was how the galaxy changed. That was how it had always changed, probably. Not by force, by information, offered honestly, between parties who were paying attention. I have been right about very few things in my career as consistently as I have been right about that. The joint training exercise was Commander Drathon's idea, and I want to be precise about that because it matters for understanding what happened next and, more specifically, what it meant that it happened the way it did. Drathon was not present on the diplomatic mission. He was stationed at the nearest Korath military post, 2 transit days from our current position, and he had received the same preliminary files I had forwarded to the Council. He had come to a different conclusion than I had. His conclusion was that humans were interesting, potentially impressive by the standards of the species the cooperative typically dealt with, but ultimately manageable, and that the correct approach to a new species whose capabilities were still being assessed was to establish the hierarchy of the relationship clearly and early. He framed his proposal as a gesture of goodwill, an invitation to train together, to share methodologies, to build the mutual professional understanding that forms the foundation of any serious military partnership. He sent the proposal through me. I forwarded it to Admiral Vale. She accepted immediately. Her response came back in under 4 minutes, which was fast enough that I suspected she had been expecting the invitation. I tried to attend as an observer. I want to be precise about my intent. I told myself it was scientific observation, the natural continuation of my biological assessment. I want to be honest, it was also that I needed to see. The files had given me data. Data is not the same as watching. I needed to see what the cardiovascular numbers looked like when they were attached to bodies in motion, when the theory became visible, and the abstract became the concrete and undeniable. We gathered on the training deck of Cooperative Border Station Meridian, a large open platform that could be reconfigured for assessment protocols of various kinds. Both medical teams set up monitoring stations along the perimeter. Both sides reviewed the parameters together, without dispute. Drathon had sent 6 of his best warriors, soldiers he had personally selected, people whose performance records he knew intimately. They were excellent. I knew their records. I had reviewed them specifically because I wanted to understand what we were comparing. Admiral Vale had sent 8 of her people. The team included the man I had noticed keeping his hands available during the first contact meeting, who I now knew was Senior Warrant Officer Colin Burke. He was of average height for a human, neither the tallest nor the most physically imposing member of the group, and he moved with the particular economy of someone for whom no motion is wasted because he has thought, at some point, about all of his motions, and decided which ones are necessary. Also present was a woman named Sergeant Petra Lane, who was small even by human standards, which is to say she was smaller than every other person in the room, and who moved with a quality of compressed stillness that reminded me, and I chose the word carefully when I wrote it in my notes afterward, of a mechanism under tension, not threatening, just very ready. The first test was endurance. The protocol was deliberate in its simplicity. A sustained physical output test at a standardized intensity level, monitored continuously by both medical teams, run without a predetermined endpoint. Both teams would continue until a natural stopping point emerged from the biology. Both sides knew the full parameters. The environmental conditions were identical for both groups. The Korath warriors were, I will say this clearly and without diplomatic softening, extraordinary. I say this not as bias but as accurate scientific observation. They were built for this. Our world made us for this. 3 of the 6 were running at output levels in the first hour that exceeded their own assessed personal records, which suggested the competitive context was drawing something additional from them. Drathon, observing from the monitoring station with a datapad in hand, and the quiet satisfaction of a professional watching a demonstration that was going exactly as expected, made several notes in quick succession. At the 40-hour mark, all 6 Korath warriors entered the phase that our physiology recognizes as mandatory recovery. I want to be clear about what this means because the framing matters. This was not failure. This was not weakness. This was the biological reality of a system that had been operating at high intensity for 40 continuous hours and required a period of restoration before continuing. It is a design feature, not a design flaw. Every machine requires maintenance. Ours requires it at the 40-hour mark of sustained high-output operation. The humans had slowed down. I want to be very careful with those 3 words, because they do not mean what they might initially appear to mean. They had slowed their pace. They were moving at a reduced output level compared to their earlier intensity. They had not stopped. They were still moving, in a steady, even rhythm, with the particular mechanical consistency of something that is not thinking about whether to continue, because continuation is simply what it is doing. At 48 hours, the Korath warriors had completed enough recovery to resume. They came back strong. The gap in output between the 2 teams had narrowed significantly, and Drathon's notes became more frequent and more confident. At the 60-hour mark, which none of us had planned for because the possibility had not occurred to anyone as a scenario worth planning for, Drathon made the decision to call the endurance test to a close and log it as inconclusive. Petra Lane, when the signal came, slowed from her pace and stopped. She sat down on the floor, which in the context of what she had just done, was a completely reasonable thing to do. She pulled out a water container, drank from it carefully and without haste, and said to Colin Burke, who had stopped beside her with an expression of mild thoughtfulness, "Good run." He said, "Good run." Nothing else. No acknowledgement that 60 hours was a number that should have carried some weight in the saying of it. No performance of what they had just done. It was the tone of 2 people discussing a competent but unremarkable afternoon. I wrote down, "Good run," in my notes, and stared at it for a while. The zero-gravity combat trials began the following session. Drathon had insisted on including them, which I understood. The zero-gravity environment removes the gravitational differential that has historically been among the most reliable of Korath physical advantages. In standard planetary gravity, our bone density and mass create a decisive mechanical edge. In zero gravity, those factors become different variables, no longer dominant in the same way. Drathon's insistence on including this trial told me he was thorough, and also that he understood which of our advantages were fundamental and which were conditional. What I watched over the next 6 hours was not a defeat for either side. I want to be precise about this. It was something else, and the something else is what I have thought about most often in the time since. The Korath warriors had trained extensively for zero-gravity environments. They had specific techniques, practiced and refined, for managing the transition from surface to space conditions. Their performance was technically excellent. They executed what they had trained to execute with consistency and precision. The humans treated the environment as information. They made errors. I watched them make errors clearly, and without any attempt to disguise them. The difference was that they corrected each error within the same engagement, often within seconds, in a way that suggested the error had been observed, assessed, and filed simultaneously with its occurrence, so that the correction arrived without a gap that would allow an opponent to use the mistake. They communicated with each other in short, precise fragments of language that carried a density of tactical information per word that our communication specialist later told me was significantly higher than he had expected, and that he would need several days to fully map. Colin Burke took a significant impact in one of the exchanges. I was watching his biometric monitor at the time, and I want to be specific. It was not a glancing contact. The monitor registered a force impact of a magnitude that our assessment protocols would categorize as a round-ending event for standard competitive purposes. He absorbed it. His body's trajectory changed with the force, as physics requires, and he used that changed trajectory, actively redirected it, so that his next position was not where the impact had sent him, but somewhere his opponent had not anticipated. His heart rate spiked. His pain response registered clearly on the monitor. And then he continued. Afterward, I found him at the equipment station and told him I had been watching his biometric data during the exchanges and was curious about the physiological regulation I had observed, particularly in the minutes following the significant impact. He looked at me with the expression of someone who is trying to understand why the question is being asked, because from inside his experience, the answer seemed self-evident. He said, "You mean when Larkin hit me?" I said, "Yes." He thought about it for a moment, with the particular care of someone who wants to give an honest rather than a simplified answer. Then he said, "I've been hit harder. It registered. I knew what had happened, and then I was somewhere else in my head, working the next problem. Pain and stopping aren't the same thing. I don't think I've ever connected them the way you might be expecting." I wrote that down exactly as he said it. I have looked at it many times. The final component of the exercise was a tactical decision-making scenario run under time pressure with incomplete information, the kind of situation that tests not strength or endurance, but the quality of thinking under adverse conditions. Both sides received the identical scenario, worked independently, and submitted their solutions. The Korath team completed the scenario in 42 minutes. Their performance score was rated high by our assessment system, which was an accurate rating. It was a good solution. It was, by the measures the scenario had been designed to apply, excellent work. The human team completed it in 38 minutes. Their performance score triggered a recalibration flag in the assessment system, which is the system's way of indicating that the solution did not map onto any of the established performance categories because the approach did not follow any of the established tactical frameworks the scenario had been designed to evaluate against. They had not found a faster route through the expected solution space. They had found a different solution space entirely, one the scenario designers had not considered because it required a willingness to treat several of the scenario's apparent constraints as suggestions rather than fixed parameters. Drathon reviewed their solution file for a long time. I watched him read it twice. Then he said, to the space in front of him rather than to anyone specifically, "They violated the parameters." I said, "The parameters did not explicitly exclude their approach." He said, "The parameters assumed a rational actor would not attempt that approach." I said, "That is an assumption about what rationality looks like in a novel situation." He looked at me. The expression on his face was one I recognized from 30 years of watching intelligent people encounter something that does not fit their framework. Not anger, not denial, but the particular stillness of a mind doing fast and serious work. He said, "I need to update my assessment." I said I was glad to hear it. He said, "I already started, 2 days ago." That was the thing that surprised me most in the entire session. Not the endurance numbers, not Burke's pain regulation, not the tactical scenario results. The thing that surprised me was Drathon, 3 decades career soldier, military liaison to the Dominion Council, a person whose professional identity was built on the Korath's unquestioned position at the apex of the cooperative's physical capabilities, saying calmly that he had begun revising his assessment 2 days before anyone had asked him to. I asked what he had changed. He said, "Everything that rested on the assumption that physical capability was the only dimension of strength worth measuring, and everything that rested on the assumption that any other species' definition of maximum output was comparable to ours." He paused. Then he said, "Their maximum output is not the ceiling. It is somewhere above the ceiling. I do not yet know where." I said, "That is, I think, the correct conclusion." He said, "It is an uncomfortable conclusion." I said, "Yes." He said, "The uncomfortable conclusions are usually the accurate ones." I said, "In my experience, yes." He nodded slowly and returned to his notes, and I went back to writing a report that was going to ask the Dominion Council to sit with the same uncomfortable conclusion and arrive at the same place. That night, in my quarters, I wrote the section of the report I had been finding reasons to delay, the section that would force the Council to look directly at what this meant for 3,000 years of established positioning. I titled it, "A Revised Understanding of the Balance of Capability," because the title I had originally considered, which used the words strategic vulnerability, felt more alarming than accurate, and I was trying to be accurate rather than alarming. I wrote that the Korath had constructed their galactic identity on a foundation that was not false, but was incomplete. We were Deathworlders. That remained true. Korthan IV had made us extraordinary in specific and documented ways. But we had assumed, because no evidence had contradicted us, that we were the only answer the universe had produced to the question of what hostile conditions generate. We had never seriously entertained the possibility of a second answer, because second answers require a second world as hostile as ours, and our catalog had not shown one. The catalog had simply been missing a world. I wrote, Korthan IV made the Korath hard. It applied specific, consistent, directional pressure, and shaped us to meet it. Earth made humans something different. Earth applied chaotic, omnidirectional, constantly evolving pressure, and shaped something that does not meet specific threats specifically, but meets all threats adaptively. Hardness and adaptability are not equivalent virtues. In environments that are stable, hardness wins. In environments that change, adaptability endures. The universe, as a fundamental characteristic, changes. I sent the section to the Council with a separate flag, marking it as requiring senior review before the 14-day scheduled session. In the morning, Priel came to my door with a look I had learned to read correctly, new information that was significant, but not catastrophic. She said, "Drathon submitted his own supplementary report to the Council last night." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He recommended that the human team be retained for an additional 2 weeks of joint assessment. He described it as wanting to understand their decision-making methodology more thoroughly." I looked at her. She said, "He wants to learn from them. He just phrased it as wanting to study them." I said, "He is allowed to call it whatever makes it easiest to file." She said, "The Council approved his request this morning." I looked out the viewport at the stars, which continued to be completely unaware of any of this. I thought about Petra Lane, 60 hours of movement behind her, saying, "Good run," the way you say it about an afternoon that went reasonably well. I thought about Colin Burke separating pain from stopping, as if the connection between those two things had simply never been a given for him. I thought about Drathon beginning his assessment revision, before anyone had asked him to, because the data was the data regardless of whether the conclusion was convenient. The galaxy had not changed. We had simply, finally, seen more of it. That was going to be enough to change everything else. The girl's name was May, and she was 8 years old, and she had absolutely no business being aboard a diplomatic mission in deep, uncharted space. And she was the most clarifying conversation I had during my entire time with the Thermopylae crew. Admiral Vale's assignment to deep exploration was multi-year, and it had already been running for 14 months when we encountered the Thermopylae. Her daughter had been with her for the last 6 months of that stretch, a decision the Admiral had made when May's school year ended, and her husband, a structural engineer, engaged in a lengthy construction project on one of Earth's orbital platforms, was committed to a schedule that made extended childcare unavailable. The Thermopylae had been designed for long-duration habitation from its original specifications. There were quarters for civilians. There was room for one small person who wanted to be where her mother was, and so she was there. The crew treated her presence as ordinary within about 3 days. She had her own quarters. She had her own daily schedule. She had a clearly understood set of rules about which areas of the ship were accessible and which were not, and she followed them with reasonable consistency. She attended remote lessons through a communication link each morning. Her afternoons were her own, and in the afternoons, she explored. She found me on what the crew called Tuesday. I was in the secondary research bay that Admiral Vale had extended the use of to my team as a continuing gesture of openness. I had Earth's biological taxonomy on the main screen, and a Korath cross-reference running alongside it, trying to establish comparison frameworks for the report. I was deep in it when the door opened. She was standing in the doorway with the posture of someone who stops and assesses before entering. She had hair the color of dry summer grass, and her eyes were conducting a thorough examination of me with the interested, unself-conscious curiosity of someone who has been told something is unusual and wants to see exactly what unusual looks like up close. She said, "Are you the alien scientist?" I said I was a scientist, and from her perspective, yes, I was an alien. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Can I come in?" I said she could. She sat across from my workstation with the ease of someone who had done this often. She looked at my screen and said, "Are those animals?" I said I was cross-referencing biological taxonomy. She said, "Do you know about the mantis shrimp?" I said I had read the file. She said, 16 types of color receptors. You probably have 2 or 3. I told her I had 4, which was above average for Korath. She was mildly and genuinely impressed. Then she said, "There is also a jellyfish that goes back to being a juvenile when it gets old, and starts over, so it could theoretically never die, as long as it does not get eaten." I said I had read about it. She said, "My teacher says that makes them theoretically immortal, just conditionally." I said that was an accurate summary. She seemed satisfied. Then she said, "What is your planet like?" I described Korthan 4th in simple language. I always use simple language when the thinking needs to be precise. I told her about the gravity, the atmosphere, the dominant fauna, and the way sustained contact with those conditions had shaped the Korath over millions of years. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "That sounds really hard." I said it was, by the standards of most cataloged environments. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Earth is hard too, but in a different way." I said I had been learning that. She said, "Did you read about the big earthquakes in the history files? The ones where entire regions were devastated?" I said there had been many significant seismic events in human history, and asked which she had in mind. She said, "There was one that hit a region where millions of people lived. It was catastrophic. Everyone expected the damage to be permanent, but then people from other regions just came to help, not because they were required to. They came, and then the people who lived there rebuilt everything." I said that mutual aid and reconstruction after disaster were recurring patterns in human history. She said, "My grandmother says it happens because humans are pretty good at remembering they need each other. She says we forget sometimes, and then something really bad happens, and we remember again." She said it the way she said all the factual things, plainly, with complete ownership of it, as though she were describing how weather works, or why rivers flow downhill. I said, "Your grandmother sounds like a wise person." She said, "She survived cancer twice." She said it the way Senavoth delivered data, with precision, without performance, fully aware of the weight while not adding to it. I said, "I am sorry she faced that." She said, "She is fine now. She runs marathons." She paused and added, apparently judging context to be needed. That is where you run a very long distance on purpose. It takes hours. I said I was familiar with the concept. She said she did not start running until after the second time. She said it felt like something she had earned the right to. I sat with that for a moment. I did not have a response equal to it, so I did not offer one. She looked at the screen again and watched the taxonomy entries scroll. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said she could. She said, "Were you scared of us? The first time?" I decided immediately on honesty, because there is no good reason to be less than honest with a child about something genuinely important. I said, "Not exactly scared. Uncertain in a way I found uncomfortable. I had spent 30 years developing a framework for understanding life in the galaxy, and meeting your people required me to revise it in ways I had not anticipated." She thought about that. Then she said, "My mom says that is what exploring really is. Not finding the things you expected, finding out your map was wrong, and drawing a better one." I said, "Your mother is also wise." She said, "She does not sleep enough." I said, "No, I do not believe she does." She was quiet for a moment, watching the screen. Then she said, "Do you know about tardigrades?" I said I had read about them. She said, "They can survive in the vacuum of space. No air, no pressure, extreme radiation, extreme temperature. They enter a kind of suspended state and wait until conditions improve. And they are everywhere on Earth. Highest mountain peaks, deepest ocean trenches, volcanic vents, Antarctic ice, everywhere. And humans share around 40% of their DNA with them." I said I had read that figure. She said, "I think about that sometimes." I said, "What do you think when you do?" She considered it carefully. There was a pause of about 4 seconds, which is a long pause for an 8-year-old in a conversation. She was not stalling. She was thinking, in the particular visible way of someone for whom thinking is a physical process you can watch happening in their expression. Then she said, "I think it means surviving is one of the oldest things in our DNA, deeper than almost anything else. There is this instruction, way down at the base, that says, shut down if you have to, preserve what is essential, wait it out, conditions will change, and then keep going." I looked at her. She had turned back to the screen and was reading taxonomy entries with the same idle thoroughness she had given everything else in the past hour. She was entirely unaware that she had just articulated, in the casual language of a child describing facts, something I was going to spend the next 3 days working through, in the formal language of a 30-year scientific career. I said, "May, how old are you?" She said, 8, almost 8.5. I said, "Have you thought about becoming a scientist?" She said, "I am going to be an engineer like my dad, but also maybe a scientist. My mom says there is no rule that says you have to pick only one." I said, "Your mother is, consistently, correct." She said, "She is okay." Then she smiled, which was the human facial expression I had been finding progressively more disarming the longer I spent aboard this ship. It communicated something warm and direct and completely without guard that bypassed every professional distance I had developed over decades and simply arrived before it could be intercepted. She stayed another 38 minutes. She asked me 16 questions about taxonomy entries. She corrected me twice on points of detail where my reading had missed nuance she had absorbed in school. She told me about a species of tree that can survive a direct lightning strike and regrow its damaged portions over subsequent seasons. She told me about the deepest ocean on Earth, nearly 11 kilometers down, and that humans had built a vessel capable of carrying a person there, just to see what was at the bottom. I asked what they found. She said, "Mostly fish, and a great deal of discarded material that should not be there, which is something humans are actively working to correct." She said this with the unself-conscious candor of someone raised to name problems directly and without softening. When she was gone, I sat in the quiet of the research bay for a long time. I thought about the instruction that said, preserve what is essential, wait it out, conditions will change, keep going. I thought about 7 extinction events and 7 recoveries, each more complex than the last. I thought about persistence hunting. I thought about Colin Burke separating pain from stopping. I thought about a woman who survived something catastrophic twice, and then started running long distances because it felt like something she had earned. I had been building a list of traits. I had been missing the single theme underneath them all. Earth had not built humans strong in one specific direction. Earth had woven into the deepest layer of their biology an ancient instruction that predated almost everything else in their genome. Do not stop. Conditions change. Wait them out. Preserve what matters. Go when you can. When you cannot, wait. Then go. The same instruction that lived in the tardigrades. The same instruction that had carried life through 7 mass extinctions on a world that looked, from a distance, almost unremarkably ordinary. I picked up my datapad and wrote the passage I had been approaching from every wrong direction for 3 days. I wrote, "Humans are not Deathworlders in the way the Korath are Deathworlders. Our world applied specific, directional, consistent pressure and shaped us into one extraordinary answer. Earth applied chaotic, omnidirectional, continuously changing pressure and shaped something different. It did not ask, what can withstand this? It asked, in every direction simultaneously and without pause, what will not stop?" I read it back. I thought, that is the most accurate thing I have written in this entire report. I thought, the council needs to understand what those words mean before they decide anything. I saved the file. I went to find Priel. She was at my door when I got there. She had her datapad in hand, and the expression she wears when she has been sitting with something for hours, and has finally found the frame that makes it legible. She said, "I reread the tardigrade section." I said, "So did I." She said, "They are everywhere." I said, "Yes." She looked at the wall rather than at me and said quietly, "And given enough time, so will humans be." We stood in the corridor of a human ship in the silence between stars, and did not say anything else for a while, because some things are said correctly once and do not require anything after them. Then we went back inside and got to work. The Varath hegemony had never been careful. In the 300 years since they had joined the cooperative's outer margin, they had demonstrated a pattern so consistent it had become a kind of institutional expectation. They identified situations where they held numerical or technological advantage. They acted on that advantage quickly and decisively, and they withdrew before a formal response could be organized. It was raiding dressed in the language of territorial dispute. It was predation with documentation. They had never been stopped cleanly. They had never faced a consequence significant enough to actually change the underlying calculation. The cooperative had issued formal protests 17 times. The Varath had acknowledged 11 of them, ignored 4, and challenged the jurisdictional basis of the remaining 2. Nothing had changed. Nothing was expected to change. This was, in the way of things that have been true for 300 years without interruption, simply how things were. I was on the Korath observation platform above waypoint 19 when the Varath struck the convoy, and I want to be precise about what I was doing. I was filing a routine observation report on the joint training sessions. I was writing about Colin Burke's pain regulation response and the tactical scenario results. I was, in other words, thinking about humans and what the data meant and how to explain it to people who had not spent the last 3 weeks watching it in person. The alert came through the platform's monitoring system before the convoy's own distress signal did. 6 ships dropping from a fold point off the primary axis. The Varath fleet signature was identifiable within seconds. The convoy was 7 cargo vessels, carrying medical supplies and manufacturing components for 3 of the cooperative's smaller member states. These were not military targets. They were not politically sensitive in any dimension that should have made them interesting to a sophisticated raider. They were simply moving goods through outer corridor space, which placed them in the category of things the Varath had decided they were entitled to interfere with when the opportunity presented itself. The 2 escort vessels assigned to the convoy were the Thermopylae and a smaller human support craft called the Ellis Ridge. They had been attached to convoy duty at Admiral Vale's request, a deliberate and calculated gesture of integration, the kind of visible participation in cooperative operations that builds the diplomatic credit a new relationship requires. I had recommended exactly this kind of assignment in my preliminary report, and when Vale had proposed it, I had been genuinely pleased. Standing on the observation platform watching 6 Varath warships materialize 17 degrees off the convoy's primary axis, I felt something considerably less than pleased, and it was, I think, something closer to the particular combination of fear and focus that comes when a situation moves from theoretical to immediate. The Varath lead ship opened with its disruption array. This was their standard opening movement, a wide-field weapon that simultaneously overwhelmed navigation systems and communication relays across the target area, creating a window of disorientation during which the convoy would typically scatter, lose coordination, and become manageable in pieces. It was a well-tested tactic. It had worked across many of the 17 incidents the cooperative had formally protested. The cargo ships scattered. That part proceeded exactly as the Varath had planned. The Thermopylae and the Ellis Ridge did not scatter. I was watching the sensor feed on the platform's secondary display when this happened, and I want to try to describe what it looked like precisely, because it was not dramatic in any way the word dramatic typically implies. There was no sudden burst of speed, no visible aggressive maneuver, nothing that registered as a decision being made. The two human escort ships simply did not do what the situation, according to every tactical framework the disruption array was designed to exploit, should have forced them to do. They moved toward the Varath fleet. Our senior platform analyst, a careful woman named Correspondent Sola, said very quietly, without any particular inflection, "Their navigation is not down."
I said, "The disruption array hit them."
"I can see the interference signature," she said. "Their communication arrays show interference. Their navigation does not. They separated the systems." I thought about the Thermopylae's hull, the visible repair marks from a dozen previous contacts, the redundancies that Senna had described as architectural rather than emergency, the compartmentalization that meant damage to one system did not cascade into adjacent systems the way it would on a vessel designed for a more forgiving operational environment. They had been built for exactly this, not specifically for this engagement, but for this class of situation, the kind where damage arrives and the vessel needs to continue functioning regardless. The Varath had been given no warning that this was true. The Varath commander had a decision to make, and the sensor data showed him making it in real time. The disruption array had fired, the cargo ships had scattered as expected, and the escorts were accelerating toward him rather than retreating. This was outside the parameter space his tactical framework had been built to address. A disrupted escort vessel accelerating into 6 warships was not a rational behavior, which meant either the disruption had not worked as expected, or the vessel was being operated by something that processed the situation differently than he had modeled. There were 11 seconds between the human ships beginning their advance and the Varath opening their second salvo. I counted them on the sensor timestamp. 11 seconds is a long time in a tactical engagement. Those 11 seconds were the Varath commander deciding what kind of situation this was. Then he fired. What followed lasted 11 minutes. And I will not pretend to a military analysis I am not qualified to give. I am a scientist. I can describe what I observed with precision, and I intend to. The Thermopylae took hits, real ones. The sensor data was unambiguous about this. Hull sections registered impact consistent with serious damage. Interior systems showed interference. The ship's energy output fluctuated in ways our analyst flagged as potential power system compromise. Any one of these readings in isolation would have been concerning. In combination, they described a vessel that was absorbing damage at a rate that should have forced a defensive posture. It continued moving forward. The Ellis Ridge, lighter and less armored, took a significant hit in its second exchange and fell back. I watched the commander of the Ellis Ridge, whose name I learned later was Lieutenant Commander Ian Morse, make a decision in real time that I think is underreported in accounts of this engagement. He did not attempt to mirror the Thermopylae's direct approach, which his vessel was not built to sustain. He identified what his vessel could do from a modified position that the Thermopylae's direct engagement was creating, and he did that. He did not stop. He adapted. He found the role that circumstances made available, and filled it without delay and without apparent distress, at the distance between the plan and the reality. The Ellis Ridge, lighter and less armored, made the Thermopylae's engagement possible from the flank. Not retreated, fell back, shifted position, and resumed contributing from a protected angle, where its smaller profile and different weapons configuration complemented the Thermopylae's more direct approach. It had found a new role in real time, adapted its function to what the situation needed, rather than what it had been assigned, and continued operating within that adjusted role, without instruction I could detect. The Thermopylae absorbed what hit it, and used the new information, the pattern of fire, the positions revealed, The gaps in coverage exposed by the salvo, to move into space, the Vareth were not defending as heavily. It was not graceful. It was not elegant. It was the movement of something that has identified the path and is committed to it, with or without the conditions being favorable. At the 3-minute mark, the Varath lost their first ship. At the 7-minute mark, they lost a second, and a third sustained damage that forced it out of active engagement and into emergency recovery position. At the 9-minute mark, the Varath fleet broke formation. I heard Correspondent Sola make a sound beside me that I believe she did not intend to be audible. I understood it. I had been watching the sensor feed with the same quality of stunned attention that comes when something you intellectually understood turns visible and concrete in front of you. The formation break was not a retreat. Not officially. Not yet. It was a tactical repositioning, and the Varath commander could file it as such in his incident report, and it would be technically accurate. But I had been reading human military history for weeks. I recognized what it actually was. It was the moment the persistence hunting worked. The moment when the thing being pursued had been moving, and absorbing, and enduring, for long enough that it stopped, turned, and found the pursuer still there, still closing, still coming. The Varath commander opened a communication channel. Not to the cooperative observation platform, not to the diplomatic frequency, to the Thermopylae directly, on an open frequency used across this entire sector of the outer corridor. 37 seconds of silence followed. I have thought many times about what was happening on both ends of that open channel during those 37 seconds. On the Varath side, a commander with 2 ships lost and a third disabled, whose tactical assessment of the situation had proved wrong in ways he had not built a contingency for, calculating what came next and what it cost. On the human side, Admiral Vale in a chair in front of a communication array, waiting with the complete and unhurried attention of someone who has learned that the moment you stop waiting is rarely the right moment. 37 seconds. I watched the timestamp count up on the sensor feed. Then Admiral Vale's voice came through, and I have thought many times since about the precise quality of her tone, because it was not relieved, not triumphant, not charged with the energy of a situation that had just resolved under extreme pressure. She sounded settled. She sounded like someone for whom this moment was the expected outcome of a process that had proceeded correctly, and who was ready to move to the next phase. She said, "This is the United Earth Navy. We are escorting this convoy to its destination. Anyone who would like to discuss alternatives to further engagement is welcome to open a channel." The Vareth opened the channel, and then something else happened that I think was more significant than the battle itself, and that I noted in my report with a separate section heading, because I did not want it to be overlooked. Correspondent Sola said, "She broadcast that on the open frequency." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not on the Varath channel, not on the diplomatic frequency, the open frequency, the one every registered cooperative species in this corridor monitors." I said, "Yes." She said, "She was not just talking to the Vareth." I said, "No, she was not." I filed an emergency report to the Korath Council. I had never done this before. I marked it with every priority flag available, and attached a personal note that said, "Please read this immediately. The situation has changed in ways the regular review schedule is not built to accommodate." The Council's response came before the Varath negotiation had concluded. It said, "We need to speak with Admiral Vale directly. Please arrange as soon as possible." I went to where Admiral Vale was concluding the Varath negotiation, in the Thermopylae's secondary communications room. She was conducting it with the quiet efficiency of someone completing paperwork on a process that was straightforward, now that the principal disagreement had been resolved. She looked up when I entered the room. I said, "The Korath Dominion Council is requesting a direct communication." She said, "About the engagement?" I said, "About much more than that." She said, "How long do I have?" I said, "They are ready when you are." She said, 2 minutes. She left the room, came back in under 2 minutes. Uniform straight, posture composed, with the settled quality of someone who has prepared for a meeting that was always going to happen and is ready for it now that it has. She sat down in front of the communication array. She looked at the screen as the Council's transmission established connection. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a long time to have this conversation, and who was glad, now, that the waiting was over. I sat in the corner of the room, as quiet and unobtrusive as I could make myself, and I watched the beginning of the conversation that would change everything. Outside, the Thermopylae sat in the space it had moved through, marked by the engagement, present, functional, holding the position it had said it would hold. I thought, the galaxy learned something today. The cooperative would file the incident. The Vareth would submit their account. There would be diplomatic correspondence and formal position statements, and the careful, measured language of institutions deciding what something meant and what, if anything, should follow from it. All of that was already in motion before the Thermopylae's sensor readings had finished logging. The machinery of formal consequence was slow and careful, as it was designed to be. What the machinery did not process, and what I was already writing in my notes as I stood on the observation platform watching the convoy reassemble in the space around the Thermopylae, was the simpler and more immediate thing. Whatever else was true about today, the next time a Vareth commander received an intelligence assessment that included human escort vessels on a convoy route, the assessment would be different. Not because the humans had demonstrated invincibility. They had not. They had taken real damage, and the Ellis Ridge had adapted to a support role, rather than pressing a direct engagement it was not equipped for. What changed was something more fundamental, the assumption that human ships would behave predictably under the standard disruption protocol. That assumption would not be made again. Assumptions, once broken, do not automatically reform. The question was what we were going to do with what we knew. My final report to the Korath Dominion Council was 411 pages long. I know that number because I counted them, the way I had counted the files on the data drive, as an act of grounding. Concrete numbers, definite answers, something to hold on to while everything else was in motion. The cover page said, simply, a revised understanding of life in the galaxy. I had spent 16 days writing it, not because 16 days was the time required to compile the data. I had the data. I had more data than I could fully process in 16 days, and some of it I was still working through even as I wrote. What I needed 16 days for was something different, finding the right sequence. The right order of presentation that would move a group of individuals who had spent their careers being the most significant biological fact in the known galaxy toward the possibility that this was no longer the complete picture. That required care. It required a particular kind of honesty that does not alarm before it explains, and does not soften what needs to be said directly. I began with the science. I always begin with the science, because it is the foundation everything else stands on. And a foundation has to be laid before you can discuss the structure above it. The biological data came first. Senavoth's cardiovascular analysis, supplemented by 63 additional biological findings we had cataloged during the time my team spent with the Thermopylae's crew. The immune memory data, the metabolic flexibility findings, the sleep deprivation tolerance curves, the persistence hunting framework, its biological basis, and its evolutionary history. The tardigrade genetic overlap, the 7 extinction event recovery pattern, presented as a visual timeline that I had specifically requested Priel render in the most direct and unambiguous format she could find, because I wanted anyone reading it to feel the shape of it before they began the intellectual work of processing what it meant. Then the observed evidence, the full endurance trial data, timestamps, biometric readings, the 60-hour mark that no one had expected to reach, the zero-gravity combat assessment, with the specific notations about real-time adaptation and the error correction rate that our communication specialist had spent 4 days fully mapping, the tactical scenario results, including the assessment system's recalibration flag and the detailed analysis of the pathway the human team had used, which our own tactical staff had reviewed and confirmed was not a violation of the stated parameters, but rather an application of the parameters that none of the scenario designers had considered possible. The Vareth engagement data came next, cross-referenced against established cooperative military performance standards and compared against equivalent Korath engagement projections. I presented this section without editorial framing. The data framed itself. Then the section that had taken me the longest to find the right language for. I wrote about the conversation with May. I included it in full, formatted as a data entry rather than a personal note, because I wanted it to be clear that I was not including it as sentiment. I was including it as evidence of something specific, the mechanism by which humans transmit their deepest cultural understanding. A species that has woven a survival imperative so thoroughly into its identity that an 8-year-old can articulate it without realizing she is doing so, has not merely adopted that imperative as doctrine. It has internalized it to the cellular level of culture. It is not a strategy. It is not a philosophy. It is simply how they understand themselves to work. I wrote, "If you want to understand what a species believes at its foundation, listen to what its children say, without prompting about the world." Mayvale did not offer this conversation as a lesson or a demonstration. She offered it as facts about the way things are. The instruction she described, preserve what is essential, endure what must be endured, conditions will change, keep going, is not in the human military doctrine. It is not in their diplomatic training materials. It is in how they explain tardigrades to people they have just met. I wrote about the handshake. I wrote about the Thermopylae waiting at waypoint 11, with the settled patience of something that has decided waiting is simply a phase of the process and not a concession. I wrote about Owen Farr decoding our language from navigation signal data as a side project. I wrote about Colin Burke. I wrote about Petra Lane. I wrote about Drathon beginning his assessment revision before anyone had suggested it was needed, because the data was the data, regardless of whether the conclusion it pointed to was convenient. I wrote about the Thermopylae moving forward through the disruption field. I wrote about the 11 seconds of Varath in action, at the moment when their tactical framework had no adequate response to what they were seeing. I wrote about Admiral Vale's open-frequency broadcast, and the specific and deliberate choice of phrasing that turned a tactical conclusion into a diplomatic opening, without erasing either one. Then I wrote the section I had been building toward since the first night I read the files. I wrote, "The Korath Dominion has maintained its position in the Galactic Cooperative for 3,000 years, on the basis of one foundational claim, that we are the only species in the galaxy shaped by true Deathworld conditions. This has been accurate. It remains accurate. Korthon IV made us extraordinary in specific and documented ways, and those capabilities are real, and they are ours, and there is nothing false or diminished about them. What I am asking the Council to add to this understanding is not a revision that reduces the Korath. It is an expansion that changes the frame around us. We are not the only answer the universe has produced to the question of what extreme conditions generate. We are one answer, the Korath answer. Humans are another, shaped by different conditions into a different capability that is not equivalent to ours and not lesser than ours. It is different in a way that matters, and in a way that, understood correctly, represents the most significant opportunity in Korath diplomatic history. Korthan IV made us hard. Earth made humans adaptive. Hardness has specific advantages in specific environments. Adaptability has advantages that scale with novelty, with uncertainty, with the kinds of environments that change faster than any fixed response can track. The universe, as a general and consistent characteristic, changes. The long-term advantage belongs to what adapts. I stopped there. I sat with that paragraph for a long time. Then I wrote the final line. The Korath became Deathworlders because Korthan IV forced us to survive. Humans became Deathworlders because they refused to do anything less. One of these is a biological fact. The other is a choice. I have spent 30 years studying life across this galaxy, and I have never before encountered a species for whom survival is not merely an instinct, but something that appears to be a deeply personal and collective point of pride. I sent the report at 0400, because that is when it was finished, and I did not see a reason to wait. The Council called a full session 2 days later, not the 14-day scheduled review. A full session, all senior members, advisory staff in attendance, priority designation on the agenda. They spent 8 hours reviewing the report in session, and 4 more hours in closed deliberation. Vane sent me a message during the closed session. It was short. It said, "The deliberation is going in the right direction." I did not reply. I sat in the Thermopylae's secondary research bay, which I had come to think of as a working space rather than borrowed space, and I waited. Outside the viewport, the stars were steady. The Council's response arrived the following morning. Before it did, I received 3 separate messages from individual Council members who had read the report ahead of the full session. 2 of them asked technical questions, specific queries about the methodology of particular data points, the kind of questions that tell you the reader has actually engaged with the material, rather than skimming for the conclusion. One of them asked whether I was personally confident in the Alliance recommendation, which was not a technical question. I responded to that one directly. I wrote that I had been confident for approximately 3 days after I first read the files, and that everything since had been the work of building a report that justified what I already knew to be true. I did not usually communicate with the Council that directly. I decided, in this case, that directness was appropriate. The full session had lasted 12 hours. I knew this because Van had been in communication with his own contacts within the military liaison office throughout, and had kept me informed in the terse, efficient way he communicated all information, with the minimum words necessary and no editorializing. His final message before the response arrived said, "Vote is being called." Then, the vote went to the Alliance. I read that message standing in the secondary research bay, where May had come to ask me about tardigrades, and I thought about all the things that had happened between that afternoon and this morning, and about how thoroughly the shape of the galaxy had changed in the interval, and about how it had not changed at all, because it had always been this shape. We had simply been working from an incomplete map. The Council's response arrived the following morning. They approved the Alliance proposal, not a consultation framework, not a preliminary engagement structure, not the cautious, hedged, iterative language of an institution that is not yet ready to commit. A full and formal Alliance proposal, to be presented to Admiral Vale on behalf of the Korath Dominion, with the stated intention of pursuing Earth's recognition as a formal partner state within the Galactic Cooperative's extended structure. They also approved my appointment as Chief Diplomatic Liaison for Earth Relations, which meant I was staying with the Thermopylae for the foreseeable future, which meant I was going where the ship went, which meant that when Admiral Vale mentioned the 2 uncharted systems in the next survey corridor, I was already going. I read the appointment notice twice. Then I put it aside and went to find the Admiral. She was on the bridge. Owen Farr was at his station, working through something on his screen, with the focused intensity that was simply how he existed when he was interested in a problem. The second officer was at the navigation console. The ship was alive with the quiet, purposeful activity of a crew that is preparing to move. The Admiral looked up when I entered. I said, "The Korath Dominion Council has authorized a formal alliance proposal. I am to present it to you on their behalf and remain as liaison." She looked at me for a moment. The expression was the one I had first seen in the secondary bay of the Thermopylae when she sat down across from me and introduced herself. Not quite surprise, not quite satisfaction. Something in the space between. The feeling of a calculation that has been running correctly, arriving at a result that is correct. She said, "Good." Then she stood and extended her hand. I knew what to expect this time. I had been shaking hands with humans for weeks. I knew the resistance, the density, the quiet competence of it. I held on just as firmly as she did. She smiled. Not the professional smile I had seen her use when she needed something to serve a diplomatic function. The real one, the kind that arrives without being arranged, because something has happened that genuinely warrants it. She said, "Welcome to the team." I thought about everything I had read in those 412 files. I thought about May and the tardigrades, and the instruction that says, "Preserve what matters. Conditions will change. Keep going." I thought about Priel standing in a corridor saying, "Given enough time, so will humans be." I thought about the galaxy I had understood for 30 years, and the galaxy as it was, which was larger and stranger and more full of possibility than any map I had ever worked from. I said, "Thank you, Admiral." She released my hand. She turned back to the navigation console and said, as naturally as if we were discussing the next item on a routine agenda, "We are planning the survey leg tomorrow. 2 uncharted systems in the next corridor. Are you planning to join us?" I said yes. She said, "Good. Get some rest tonight. We leave at first light." I left the bridge. In the corridor, Priel was there, which did not surprise me, because Priel was always somewhere nearby when things that mattered were happening. She had her datapad in hand. She looked at my expression, and then she said simply, "Alliance." I said, "Alliance." She said, "Do you think they know what they have taken on? With the Korath, I mean, with us." I thought about it. I thought about 11 years of observation before speaking. I thought about custom-fabricated resting structures built from sensor data in 4 hours. I thought about Admiral Vale saying ready enough to be taken seriously with the certainty of someone who had measured the distance and was confident in her own legs. I said, I think they measured very carefully before they flew this ship to the edge of everything they had ever mapped, and waited at a waypoint for whoever showed up. I think very little about what they do is unconsidered. She said, "Do you think we know what we have taken on? With them?" I considered that honestly. I said, "No. I think we are just beginning to understand it, and I think it will take a long time to fully understand it. And I think that is probably exactly right, because something this significant should take a long time to understand properly." She said, "Good." I looked at her. She said, "I would rather have something genuinely interesting to spend the rest of my career on." I started walking toward my quarters. She fell in beside me, datapad in hand, already thinking about the next thing. I want to record one final observation from that day, something I noticed and did not put in the official report because I did not know how to quantify it, but which I think belonged there, and which I include here, because this document is also meant as an honest account. When I left the bridge after Admiral Vale said welcome to the team, I stopped in the corridor just outside the bridge door for a moment. Through the door, which had not fully closed, I could hear the sounds of a working ship, the navigation officer running through departure protocols, Owen Farr's voice, noting something about the uncharted system's preliminary spectral data, two crew members at the back of the bridge discussing the timeline for the survey leg with the comfortable shorthand of people who have done many survey legs together and do not need to explain the context to each other. It was the sound of ordinary work, the ordinary work of people who had just secured an alliance with the oldest established Deathworld species in the known galaxy, who had, in the preceding weeks, demonstrated physical and tactical capabilities that required us to revise 3,000 years of institutional self-understanding, and who were now talking about departure protocols and spectral data, not performing calm, not suppressing the significance of what had happened, simply, genuinely, already on to the next thing. I thought, this is also what they are. This is also how they work. I thought, I am going to be learning from them for a very long time, and I am genuinely glad about that. Then I went to pack for the survey leg. Outside the viewports of the Thermopylae, the stars were the same stars they had always been. The galaxy was the same galaxy. But the map had changed, the way all good maps change. Not because the territory moved, but because someone finally went far enough to see what was actually there. Tomorrow we would go further. I filed one final personal note to the Dominion archive that night, separate from the official report, to be stored in the research record rather than the diplomatic file. It was not long. I do not usually write personal notes for the archive, but this seemed like an occasion that called for it. I wrote, "I have spent 30 years in this work trying to understand what life is and what it produces. I have cataloged, observed, measured, and reported. I have been, in the way that any disciplined researcher tries to be, objective. I have tried to see things as they are, rather than as I expected them to be. I was not objective about this. I could not have been. This was too large for objectivity in the early stages. What I could do, and what I believe I did, was recognize when my expectations were wrong, and update them, without attachment to what they had been. That is the scientist's version of the thing the humans do. You encounter the obstacle, you learn from the encounter, you keep going. The galaxy has not changed. We have simply learned more of what is in it, and what is in it is more interesting than I knew." I closed the file and went to sleep, and in the morning we left. Tomorrow, we would go further. I was looking forward to it more than I had looked forward to anything in a very long time.